So this is a continuum from last lecture. I'd split these because I think got a little bit heavy to carry on. But I'd really like to cover two more things in our exercise testing section to complete this and to help you with your case. So we covered maximal exercise testing, and then we looked at submaximal exercise data that we get from the maximal CPET, cardiopulmonary exercise test. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the metabolic machinery in the child versus the adult. And that gets us into a little bit of this information around metabolism and the higher intensity anaerobic capacities. So these are old data from Erickson from the 1970s, which were muscle biopsies in boys and men, something that I think we could do now. We've changed the techniques for muscle biopsies to make them a lot less painful and invasive, but nonetheless, this is not something that gets done regularly. So he looked at a whole raft of issues around the metabolic machinery in children compared to adults. Remember, this is a male-only study. He looked at fiber typing, which is what this graph is showing you. So he measured the same boys at age 11 and then again at age 13, and he measured a group of adult males as a comparison. And if you can see at the chart, this is the percentage of fiber types, and they're color coded. So those type 1, the slow twitch fibers, the oxidative fibers, are the reddy purple fibers, and the type 2, those, we know there's multiple types, but we're just going to generically clump them into type 2. Those are our glycolytic fibers, the fast twitch fibers that allow us to have more of that high level anaerobic capacities. So you can see at 11 years of age, the boys were really predominantly type 1 fibers, more than 60%. And as they aged, but even 2 years, when they were 13, you can see the percentage of the type 2 increases and the percentage of the type 1 declined. So children are very well equipped for endurance type activities. And this might be evolutionary. They need to mobilize and they need to keep going. They don't have to be that good at fast sprinting, but that means that this lower glycolytic fiber type means that there is a lower anaerobic capacity, but really to survive they needed an endurance capacity. Erickson also looked at the enzymatic quantity or the quality of the muscle, and these are some of his glycolytic enzyme data. So he again measured boys at 11.5, 12.5, 13.5, 15.5, and then he had a group of adult men to compare these with. And you can see in this graph, he measured a number of chemicals, if you like. Well, these are your well-known metabolites actually at the cellular level, from creatine phosphate, CP, adenosine triphosphate, ATP, and also glycogen. Sorry about the spelling, but this comes from a European slide. So you can see again the percentage of adult values are on the y-axis, and these change remarkably from that prepubertal boy to the pubertal boy. So glycolytic enzyme activity was also a lot less in the child. So 59% greater in the adults compared to the children, 42% greater in the adolescents compared to the children. So the child had a very, very much reduced glycolytic enzyme capacity, which makes sense. They had largely type 1 muscle fibers. And you can see that their ability to produce CP and ATP is and particularly utilize glycogen is a lot less when they were prior to puberty. So kids create ATP via oxidative metabolism. Their CP glycogen stores are small. They don't really have that fiber typing yet, and therefore the metabolic enzyme concentrations are small. But as they develop, they start to produce these, and with both size of muscle increasing, this qualitative aspect of the muscle is changing to make them more glycolytic. So, back when I did my PhD, we were interested in lactate production. There was Jo Welsman, who was in my lab. She had done this for her PhD. And interesting, what she'd shown is blood lactates were much, much less at maximal exercise compared to adults. They were, the childhood maximal blood lactate was only about 60% of that of the adult. And if you look at these comparisons, the maximal muscle lactate was equally low. This might be in part due to the fiber type changing. And when Erickson first did the work, he interpreted this to mean that children didn't actually have certain enzymes, particularly PFK, phosphofructokinase. He argued that they didn't actually have this enzyme. Was later found out that wasn't the case, but the metabolic engine is different. We haven't done the work because our understanding of lactate has changed substantially since the late 80s and 90s. And work by George Brooks has shown that lactate's actually a substrate, and it's not the production of lactate is not an acidic reaction. It's actually an alkalinic reaction. Acid is produced, but that's not from lactate. And lactate gets shuttled into the mitochondria, into the mitochondrial reticulum, and it can be used oxidatively to fuel exercise. And it might well be that the lactate is simply taken up by the mitochondria in children. So although they can produce it, they utilize it as a major fuel source. But nonetheless, we don't use lactates because we just simply don't see those capillary blood concentrations of lactate that we would have otherwise achieved in an adult. So it's not a good marker in a child, or certainly not with the technology we have right now. So the child is oxidatively preferential. They will support even higher intensity exercise oxidatively because they have this much smaller glycolytic engine. How do we measure these things? Well, just the same as you do in adults. We measure using a Wingate bite protocol. The only thing different is our loading. This is just a little tiny. They actually did these mini Wingates with 3-year-olds, but we don't work with this age group. We work with the sort of 7+ age group. Our loading is slightly less, but it is a test of peak power and mean power. What do you get? Well, this is data to show that these are endurance-trained athletes, untrained adults, and children. So if you look at the lines, we have our untrained adults, our endurance, and our children. These are our adults. This is our boys versus untrained men versus endurance-trained men. And the children are disadvantaged in that short-term maximal intensity event. In other words, their ability to produce power, this is watts per kg, is less because they have less muscle mass. And often coaches are desperate to get the most out of their young athlete, but you're not going to get that much out of them until they've got to a certain point in their maturation. So you can see this is the time it takes to reach peak power, and you can see in the adults and the elite endurance trained athletes it's a very short, very steep peak power very quickly. The children, there's this slower curve, really kind of a little bit like a plateau. You don't get this steep incline and then the drop off. But what's interesting is that the relative contribution during the Wingate test in the child is actually highly oxidative. So the boys contribute, there's a great deal more oxidative metabolism throughout the Wingate test than compared to the untrained males. And the boys are very similar to endurance trained males, which utilize all food sources. Because remember, that initial peak power is then the initial few seconds, first 5 to 10 seconds of the test, but then you keep the test going for 30 seconds, and that's your mean power across the whole test. This is the contribution of the aerobic versus the glycolytic sources. And you can see at the ends of the test, when we look at our children, they're way up there with the endurance athletes. In fact, a little bit higher than the endurance athletes, although I don't think it's significant. It was only significantly different from our untrained adults. So the metabolic machinery of the child is actually very efficient. They can sustain high intensity work for these longer periods, 20 to 30 seconds, and they do so simply using their aerobic metabolism. And that has a benefit. And the benefit is that they recover quicker. So if you look at the recovery in the children, this is a post heart rate recover post a Wingate test. Very, very sharp recovery in the children, far less so in the adults and the trained and untrained adults. So, the children may not have the capacity to really produce peak power, but they can produce high levels of power over time. The mean power is high. They support that oxidatively, and that allows them to recover quicker, whereas the adults are supporting that largely glycolytically, and they take a longer time to recover. So remember, where kids are at in terms of maturation will determine how much power they can produce in terms of that peak power, but it also, we interpret what they can do in a slightly different lens. They do actually recover faster. So the anaerobic or the glycolytic system is developmental, and the metabolic engine, of course, is developmental. And these are considerations when we think about how to train and to get the most out of a young athlete. So I want us to switch gears a little bit, because I'm thinking of the case and I'm thinking about a young athlete, and we need to know first of all where they're at in terms of their maturation status. And we need to understand a little bit about what that means in terms of their trainability in the different aspects that are going to help them become the elite young athlete. And I'm going to show you this picture because it relates so well to the metabolic machinery I've just shown you. This was a graph that we drew. We drew data about the maximal speeds and how those changed in boys and girls with age. It's chronological age, but it is a reflection of that metabolic machinery changing with maturation. And if you look at the really high intensity, short, sharp events like a very short sprint or a kind of mid-distance sprint to the middle distance running, you can see that for a start, the boys and girls don't differ much in this prepubertal age. And then you get to puberty and there's just this vast increase in 100 meters, huge in 400 meters. And this is a reflection of peak power and a reflection of increased mean power. And then the endurance system, remember, these are very, very oxidative creatures. They get better because there's a change, as we know, in heart size, stroke volume. There,'s a change in muscle mass. There's a change in lungs. But this is a smaller increase because this is just a refining of that oxidative energy. So, maturation, puberty is a very, very strong indicator of performance in these high intensity, short, sharp activities that require a lot of power. And if we don't take consideration of these things, if we start to try to train aspects of the child that the child's not ready for, it results in dropout. So you really have to consider what happens, and this is the classic triangle. There's this huge group of potential young athletes at a young age in schools and in the community. Many of them are cut because they don't make the grade. Lots of them drop out, and the dropout continues all the way to the top. But to retain a broader base, so we don't, we get to choose national representation, more young athletes get to this point, we have to stop them dropping out and we have to stop them getting cut. So we need to maximize their abilities to perform better as they get older. So what does that mean? As I said, it means you've got to understand their individual tempo and TIMO, where are they at, what's the stage of development, utilising things, as we know, like peak height velocity. It can be used in the testing and in the planning of the training going forward. They're really what they call the 5 S's: stamina, meaning endurance training, strength, speed, skills and suppleness. These are kind of the 5 S's that all young athletes need to possess, and different quantities of each depending on the sport that they're in. And if we know something about their individual tempo and timing, and we know something about their metabolism, their capacities, we know something about their exercise physiology, we'll be able to optimize when we train, whether it's their aerobic velocities, their speed velocities, or their strength velocities. We'll know when these things are going to peak. It requires monitoring. We need to test and work with the coach, and the coach needs to then plan and give structure and sequence to be able to return that young athlete to the monitoring process to be able to ensure that they are developing as we would like them to. So just a final few words on some of these optimal windows. So there's a really lovely model that was created by Oliver and colleagues from Wales called the Youth Long-Term Athletic Development Model. It's in a number of different books and articles, but I just took this picture from the Picardo reference, where this is for the males. I'll show you in a moment, the females, where they have this long-term athlete development model where what comes first is suppleness, then speed and skills. There's a smaller incline, this is in the prepubertal years, but the stamina and speed are really increasing during the pubertal years, and strength once you get that large gain in muscle mass. So this is tapped over our peak height velocity curve in the boys, and of course in increasing maturational status. So when we think about how we get kids into sport, when they're prepubertal, they sample a lot of sports. It should be fun. They start to learn how to train. In that pubertal zone, they're starting to specialize. They're starting to train and to compete. And then in that late pubertal, they're really specializing and training to win. And we're trying to make sure we retain them in the sport. So, prepubertal, lots of motor skill development and suppleness, mobility. They do have some increases in speed, power and strength, but these are small because there's very little hypertrophy. And of course, as they grow, they do get some endurance training too. But in that circumpubertal, that mid-pubertal and late pubertal age, you really start to see there's hypertrophy in the later puberty, and we really get increases in power and strength. Speed in our mid-puberty, but really the power and strength in our late puberty. So these are the real critical windows when we think about what we should be training and at what age. Similar chart for the girls, these different early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence and adulthood. We can align that to peak height velocity, pre, during, post. Again, lots of skills, mobility and agility in those pre-pubertal years. We can still work on speed, power and strength and on endurance, but it's going to not have such a big impact. When we get into puberty, we're really going to get a bigger impact on agility, speed, power and strength. And as soon as we get hypertrophy, that's when strength and endurance really come to the fore. So these are important windows. If we are working with a young athlete, we know that they've got a lot of extra gain to come in strength and endurance. If we're working with a pubertal, late pubertal, early adulthood athlete, we're in that period, but we've already probably gained the mobilities and the agilities that we're trying to gain. So classic training prescriptions now. We've measured this child. We know what their aerobic fitness is like. We want to try to increase aspects of that. Maybe we want to increase the percentage of peak VO2 at an anaerobic threshold. This should be our classic improvement for peak VO2. Will improve our submaximal parameters. We would be expecting 3 to 4 sessions a week for at least 40 minutes. And in children, and even in circumpubertal, we have to train them at a high maximal heart rate, 85 to 90% of maximal heart rate to get the benefit. And even with that prescription, the benefit at maximum is quite small, but the benefit at submaximum is quite large. And we would expect that to take about 12 weeks. So be conscious of that as when we think about where our submaximal parameters fell in terms of heart rates. We really need to get them up there in terms of maximal heart rate if we think that we're going to be changing peak VO2, but we can be using some long endurance sessions where we're at our threshold, our ventilatory threshold, which would be a much lower heart rate. So this is kind of a more practical prescription, and I'm sorry this is a bit small on this screen, but you can look at the reference on Canvas where, again, that prepubertal It would be short duration, fun interval work, maybe 45 minutes, lower heart rates, and then only 10 minutes of that upper heart rate. When we get into that early to mid-pubertal, we would be doing longer sessions, much more intense sessions, as well as some sport-specific sessions, which would be that threshold, and then some really high intensity interval training to try to look at speed and that sprintability. And then that late pubertal working again at the same kind of high intensity work for these longer sessions, but also now looking at repeated sprint training and high intensity interval training, really lot of hard, high hitting intensity sessions during the week, and we'll get a bigger gain in our aerobic capacities. So what about strength? You can get gains prior to puberty, but they're nothing like the gains you're going to get post-puberty. It really is the increases in muscle mass that are creating these gains. This is not really an increase in muscle mass. You're just getting neurological adaptations prior to puberty. There's not really a pubertal boost in strength. It's really at post-puberty that we see the boost in strength. So basic prescriptions for the younger child, only less than 60% of one repetition maximum. As they get to increase, we get up to about 80% of one repetition maximum. And then in that more pubertal zone, we would go to 85% of one repetition maximum and much faster velocities. So more skill-based when they're young, more real weight lifting when they get older. What about speed? Well, this is kind of neat data. This was the effect of different training methods on running speed at different pubertal moments. This again is a male-only paper. You can get some gain in speed prior to puberty, but a lot more in puberty, 6% faster compared to 2 to 3%. And in circa puberty, there's a lot going on, so that was a big range, 1.5 to 3%. That should be a dot, not a dash. Kind of smaller gains in some circa pubertal, but there's other things that are going on in that mid-puberty. Speed is not something that we would necessarily be working at. We would be really concentrating more on our endurance training. So just to finish up, in our session on submaximal exercise, we looked at the information we could get from the data in a peak VO2 test, but really looking at that submaximal data and looking at the thresholds and the slopes, and you can use this information to determine, to specify the determinants of the exercise response. You can say, well, it was ventilatory. We've got our VE, VCO2 slope. Oh, it's cardiovascular. Let's look at the oxygen pulse, VO2 by heart rate. Or it's metabolic. Let's look at the periphery. Let's look at VO2 wattage or heart rate wattage. These are really valuable components of the whole. But remember, even when working high intensity, children are largely oxidative specialists. They become more glycolytic as they leave puberty. And that really occurs with growth of muscle. So post-peak height velocity, remember it's about 2 years in lag. And that increase in maturation means the gain in muscle means a change in fiber typing. And training success requires knowledge of these things. You need to know maturation, you need to know what kind of metabolic changes are accompanying that, and where are the windows, the critical windows of opportunity for training in the different aspects that we need to produce an elite young athlete.